Today, though, we are going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And again, for those of you maybe that are just kind of coming in cold and haven't been with us, as a church, we've been studying this ancient letter called 1 Corinthians, which you may or may not have heard of, but it's a letter in the Bible, a fairly long letter. And it was composed by one of Jesus's pretty early disciples. His name was Paul the Apostle. You've probably heard of him. And Paul had really committed his life to establishing churches in various regions. I mean, he traveled from place to place. He'd kind of hang out for a time, and he would proclaim the gospel, right? This gospel message that he had come to believe with all of his heart. He had committed his life to going into a place and telling other people that had not yet heard the gospel message, and he brought it to them. And so in various places, these churches would kind of sprout out. And Paul had this continual relationship with the churches even after maybe he had left that particular place to go on and do something else. And so what we've been handed down for the last couple thousand years now, are essentially copies of this letter, as well as other letters that he's written, but this one specifically, this letter that he wrote to a church that he had helped establish in a place called Corinth. That's why it's called 1 Corinthians. And so in this letter, there's all kinds of things that we can learn that the church in Corinth was dealing with, some of the challenges that they were facing, some of the problems that they were undergoing, and we understand that as a church in 2024, we have challenges. Can I get an amen? Right? We have problems. Right? That's the people that go to church here that are talking right there. We have a lot of those same things, and what this letter does as we start to understand what it meant to Paul's original audience is, well, now what does this mean to us? And so that's what we've been doing. That's what we're going to continue to do. And that's, in fact, we're going to take one very, very small little sliver out of that pie this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 17. Again, this is Paul, and this is what he writes to the church in Corinth. Now, in giving this instruction, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. How many of you are expecting to come to church and hear a message about why you shouldn't go to church? Right? Probably nobody, right? What a great Easter message we are preparing ourselves for here. But let me ask you a question. When people gather together, that can be a good thing or a bad thing, right? When people gather together in groups of all kinds of sizes, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. If you're talking about a basketball team that is down significantly in a game and they go into halftime into the locker room, that halftime speech and that gathering time that they have together, it can be good, right? Where the coach just figures out exactly the right words to motivate his team to kind of get back into the game and to, fight to reestablish themselves and perhaps even create an upset, or that time of gathering can be negative, right? Where the coach maybe just berates everybody for how poorly they performed in the first half and how much of a failure they all are. Business meetings, those can be positive, productive. They can also be pretty negative, right? They can really kind of spiral downwards into a very negative place. Certain demonstrations that happen, gatherings of people that are demonstrating for one purpose or another, that can have a positive thing to it in just bringing into public recognition something that people need to see and hear and be aware of, or it can go bad and it can turn into violence and uprising, things like that. Some of you are going to have a holiday meal with friends and family. Let's be honest, that could go well, right? Some of you know it might not go so well. So my question is, can churching leave you worse off than how you came. Paul here in this text, again, let me read it. Now, in giving this instruction, I do not praise you since you come together, not for the better, but for the worse. We might assume that gathering together as a church, right, doing this very thing that we're doing this morning, how could it be anything but positive? Hopefully, up to this point, it has been a positive thing, a positive experience. And let me just make you aware that when I talk about things like gathering as a church, I am not limiting that experience to exactly what is happening in this room at this very time, but what it means to gather together as a church in the various ways and at the various times that we do, especially in a prolonged series of gathering, right? That is, that we as a church, there is a way of being that describes or that would describe us. There is a way that we are as a collection of people. What Paul seems to recognize within the Corinthian church is that their gathering had given rise to the opportunity of it becoming something that made them worse off for having gone than better off. Now, let me talk just some terms here. When we talk about church, right, the word for church that we find in the Bible is a word that describes something like an assembly, people who were called out or summoned to assemble. It was very often used, if you think about like politically oriented assemblies. People would gather together for some particular reason. And so the people that came, who were essentially summoned out from a community, that would have been called the church. And so when it comes to those who are following Jesus, there is a sense in which these followers of Jesus were summoned out, and now as a gathered people, they took on this term of church. And so obviously when we say the word church in English, there are all kinds of various things that may come to mind. It may be something as simple as a building, maybe a building that we used to attend. Very often, that's the kind of thing. It may be the service in which we are meeting, right? We go to church, right? And so we kind of think of that. We like to think as the church of, primarily the number one thing that we want to come to the front of everybody's mind is we're talking about people, right? That the church is not a building. The church is not an event. The church is ultimately people. So when the church gathered, Paul says the net effect of that was negative, right? In mathematical terms, the experience was negative. And so again, we ask, can churching, this going to church, as being part of a church, perhaps, can it leave you worse off than how you came? I'll bet you that some people can say yes to that. I'll bet you there's people here that maybe came to church even on Easter Sunday morning, reluctantly, largely because of an experience or a series of experiences or an understanding that they have regarding the church that ultimately frames for them negative connotations, right? That the church is something that perhaps we are better off without. I want to ask the question, well, why were people coming together in the first place, right? So Paul here in this text, he references the fact that they come together. Why were they even coming together? Why are we doing this, right? We would ask ourselves. Matthew chapter 28, verses 5 and 6, and I know we heard another, one of the gospel writers, his recollection of the resurrection, and here's another one, Matthew chapter 28, verses 5 and 6. The angel told the women, don't be afraid, because I know you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here, for he is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Right? And so the gospel writers, they all record for us the event of Jesus' death and his resurrection. And what I would ask for us to consider is, well, did that really happen? I mean, you read just those couple of verses, but even the broader story of the resurrection, I mean, there's There's angels that are talked about. There's this massive stone that's been rolled away. There's someone who really died and then really came back to life again. And when I say they died and they came back to life, I don't mean like they were dead for 12 minutes, right? And then they were injected with, with some kind of chemical or given the paddles and resuscitated and brought back to life. I'm not talking about the scene where Luke Skywalker kind of looks back and he sees Yoda and Obi-Wan and Anakin, kind of there, glowing in their green halos, right? We're not talking about a spiritual resurrection. How the story goes is that a man physically died, was dead for days, and then he came back to life. And so the question that we all have to wrestle with is, well, do we actually believe that? I mean, it's crazy. Again, angels, men, women, an empty tomb, all this stuff. Well, there were some who did believe it. There were some that, to the very core of their being, believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And the cross and the resurrection fundamentally changed the direction of their lives. Right? So Paul, the one who wrote this letter, he would have been one of those kinds of people, as were many others who had come to experience the reality of the resurrection. It wasn't some story, it wasn't some fable, it wasn't some mythological tale that was intended to convey some kind of spiritual truth that might make us all a little better as men and women and boys and girls. But it was real. And it was gritty. It was physical. It happened, right? At least that's what they had come to believe. And with that, there was this fundamental change in the direction of their lives. There's people in this room right here and right now who believe with all of their hearts that Jesus died on the cross and that he rose from the dead. And it has fundamentally changed the direction of their lives. Because this is what happens when you come to embrace something like that. Well, prior to that, you could just kind of go off as you please with your life. But when the resurrection of Christ intersects your life and becomes a reality in your own, it disrupts you, it disorients or reorients you in a completely different direction. See, belief in the resurrection doesn't let you go back to business as usual. Again, we're asking the question, why were these people gathering together? Why were things like churches forming? Why, 2,000 years later, do we continue to do this? Why are we here this morning? It's because there are some of us who believe with all of our hearts and all of our soul that Jesus really rose from the dead. Another reason why the church was gathering together was not just this belief, but because they understood that something like rhythm in our lives is important. You see, they didn't meet sporadically. They didn't meet once in a while. They met regularly. They met often. They met continually because they understood the importance of having a kind of cadence or rhythm in their lives. We see ourselves how rhythm is important to our own lives. The reason why is because God has wired that into us. He's created that into us. In fact, when we really think about the way God has created and ordered for us to live, one of the things that he has established is that over the course of 7 days of a week, one of those days is reserved back, it is held back, in which we are to do no work. It's a Sabbath. How many of you have heard of the Sabbath before? Right? The Sabbath is a day where our work comes to an end and we are given back the gift of living as if there's nothing else to do. Now, our world, some of our world still practices the discipline of Sabbath. Much of our world has co-opted it in another way. We have, in our kind of more secularized version of life, we have the weekend, right? One day is not enough. We need two, right? Right? So we have the weekend. We have that kind of rhythm built into the framework of our lives. For most of us, right? For most of us, there's 5 days we go to work, 2 days we don't, right? Unless you have one of those schedules where it's 4 days off, 3 days off, whatever. But whatever the reality is for your life and mine, rhythm is important. And so built into the framework of all peoples, whether it was the nation of Israel, who had their rhythms, their holidays, their festivals, right, that would continue and to recur. Pagan religions, they had the rhythms of their own religions as well. We continue to live that out when we think about the way that we holiday. Today's a holiday, right? There's a chance that maybe today is, there's a tradition for you and your family that you're going to continue to practice today. Right? So rhythm is important. Hebrews, another letter written to the early Christians, says, let us consider one another in order to provoke love and good works, not neglecting to gather together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging each other, and all the more as you see the day approaching. There's this encouragement given to the earliest followers of Jesus to continue these intervals of gathering together, that it's important. It provides the opportunity for us to consider one another, for us to provoke things like love and good works within each other. It's something that we're not supposed to neglect because the rhythm is important. So that's why they gathered. That's why some of us continue in this practice of gathering on a regular basis. But given that, well, then why did people end up worse off for having gone to church? Why did people end up worse off for having gathered together? Well, some of you understand the various problems that were occurring within the life and the culture of the Corinthian church. There were things like cliques that had formed. There was things like favoritism that was being shown. And these kinds of things that had become so ingrained within the culture were actually having a net negative effect on the lives of the people who made up this church. Every time you have various cliques that are forming these groups, there are rules and conditions that define who gets to be in the group and then who is left out. And so within the Corinthian church, they were guilty of reflecting what was occurring in the broader culture. And that is that the broader culture celebrated things like social class distinctions. There were various ways in which people were seen or valued depending on where they kind of sat in the social hierarchy, right? And so the higher up you were, the more you were worth, the less or the lower you were in the social class order, the less you were worth. And there was no place for this within the church. The church was supposed to eradicate all of these social class distinctions. But what we find here is Paul describing the kind of scenario where those distinctions were being maintained. That there were distinctions being made between the rich and the poor, for instance. And so what that ultimately did was it reinforced prejudices within the lives of people that Jesus' kingdom had intended to tear down and eradicate. That would ultimately manifest in things like favoritism being shown between, for one person versus another. How many of you would like to go to a church that showed favoritism? Well, if you happen to be among the favorites, maybe you wouldn't mind it so much. But my guess is that if you didn't meet the criteria for being among the favorites, well, you wouldn't want to be a part of that kind of church. You see, what was happening was the culture and the practices of the church were causing malformation. Malformation. That is, that everybody who participated within the life of the church, they were being formed. Unfortunately, they were being malformed. That is, they were being formed in a bad way. They were being formed negatively. For those maybe that were on the in, for those maybe that were up here on the social hierarchy, they were being formed negatively because what was being reinforced in their lives was this idea of how much better they were than people who were at a lower social rank than they were. what was obviously and clearly happening for those maybe that were on the lower social part of the order was they were being malformed because all the lies that they had been fed and told all of their lives were reinforced by the dynamics of the way the church was operating and the culture that had so become ingrained. The people here who were being left out, they were impacted as well as those who were not. So the culture and the practices of the church were causing malformation. Not only that, but the culture and the practices of the church were compromising Jesus' mission. Now, when we talk about the mission of Jesus, we could sum it up by saying that Jesus' mission was to redeem humankind, right? That's what he came to do. Jesus came to set us right with God. That is, that without Jesus' intervention, we, all of us, every single one of us, is not right with God. And guess what? There's nothing we can do to make ourselves right with God. Nothing. Right? The offering buckets have already been passed, right? Too late. Right? But giving money to the poor, going to church, you name the religious deed or whatever, like there's nothing we can do to make ourselves right with God. That required Jesus' intervention, and so his mission was to redeem humankind. Jesus is the Redeemer. One of the cornerstone building blocks of what we understand as a church that informs how we exist as a church is Jesus is the Redeemer. There's no person in this place that will redeem anybody. There's no person in this place that is tasked with the responsibility of making you right with God. That's the role that Jesus plays in each of our lives, and we are all as equally in need of that intervention as another. There's no difference between how much I need Jesus' intervention for that as a person who has just walked into a church building for the very first time in his or her life. So Jesus, he's the Redeemer. He died and rose again to make redemption possible. And so the church itself isn't a redeemer, but the church, again, when I say church, I don't mean this building. When I say church, I don't mean this thing that we're doing right now. I mean the people that are the church. The church isn't a redeemer, but the church plays a role in redemption, in carrying on the work of Jesus. That work is to, if I could say it this way, to take back, right, to redeem what hell has stolen. And how do we do that? Well, we do that through various processes of subversion, of turning things on their head. When you read through the stories and the teaching of Jesus' life, what you find in the way in which he brought revolution to this world is he brought revolution not through violence. He brought revolution not through deceit. Right? Those are the ways that we see revolution happening in our world most of the time. If there's going to be a revolution, well, then maybe we leverage things like propaganda, right, to misinform the masses and ultimately get them to believe something that isn't true, right? That would be revolution by deceit. We see that kind of thing happen all the time. Then there's revolution by violence, right? We're going to take what we want by force. We see that kind of thing happening all the time. Well, Jesus, he brought utter revolution to the world. He brought utter revolution to his day, but he did it neither through deceit nor through violence. He did it through subversion, turning things on their head. You see, it was, or it could be thought as conventional wisdom, that the way you defeat your enemy is you fight back. You make yourself stronger and you win, right? Jesus, though, what he taught was that the way we defeat our enemies is by what? By loving them. You know what that is? That's subversion. That's turning things upside down. And we see this, like if you don't read the Bible, you ought to read the Bible and find how subversive it is when it comes to the world in which we live. turned things on their head. But the church was, because of their culture and their practices, they were compromising that whole mission. What they were doing was they were just simply adopting the way of the world, and they were bringing it into the fabric of who they were as a church. It's like, oh, well, the world celebrates class distinction and social hierarchy. We will as well. But the kingdom of God says there's no place for that. There's a third reason why people were worse off. A few chapters later in 1 Corinthians, a famous kind of text about the resurrection of Christ, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 says, now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? If there's no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our proclamation is in vain, and so is your faith. And so Paul here, he recognizes that for some in the church, apparently the effect of the cross and the resurrection, the thing that had caused them to come and gather together in the first place, over the course of time, it seems that the power of those messages had worn off. Some people might think from the outside that part of the problem with the church is that the church is it just believes too strongly in the things that it teaches or holds. That would be one of the criticisms that the outside world would often leverage on the church. I would, from my perspective, as a person on the inside, I'd say that our problem as the church is probably not so much that we have believed too much or too greatly, but that we have believed too little. We've believed too little. We've lost our faith in the effect of the cross and the resurrection. And so what happens is, because the church has become more institutionalized, and as an institution, the church, or the people who are running the church, they're trying to hold on for dear life to what they have in the way of power and influence and all that. And because the effect and the power of the cross and the resurrection is no longer there to bring people into the church, now we have to resort to things like power structures and manipulation and guilt. How many of you ever felt like the church was just making you feel guilty to try to coerce you into, I don't know, behaving better or doing better? We align ourselves. The church has become guilty of aligning itself, oftentimes with power structures in the world. Again, instead of subverting the culture in the world in which we live, it has tried to make alliances with the outside world. A lot of times, those are political alliances. You see the various flags that a church will wave on the outside. I don't know if you noticed, but when you came into this church, there's no flags being waved out there. This isn't a red church or a blue church, right? Because we understand that what we belong to, who we belong to, transcends and supersedes any of the humanly established power structures of this world. The church has become, unfortunately, guilty of a belief that has become shallow instead of deep. Again, the problem isn't the church believes too much or too rigidly. It's not because the church is held too fast and too hard to its dogma. The problem is that we've believed too little. Our belief, our faith has become more superficial rather than truly through and through. And so, this is what left the church worse off. And so, we come to a question for us. Should I then just church on my own? Right? Like, I want to be a person of faith. I want to be a person who's pursuing a spiritual life, a life being lived in commitment to Jesus. And if you're here and you've been disenfranchised because of the institution of the church for one reason or another, it might seem like a very attractive option for you to commit yourself to something like private discipleship. You think, well, maybe this is the way forward for me so that I can avoid all of the negative effects of the institutionalized church. I mean, we see examples of how we can proceed with various things, pursuits in our own lives and do them on our own just fine, right? Like if you want to, you can enroll in a class online and study at your own pace. You can learn literally anything, whether it's some aspect or matter of theology. You don't have to go to seminary, right? You can learn all this stuff online. You don't have to join a gym if you want to become more fit. Like you can subscribe to some particular plan and purchase the equipment, do it right there in the privacy of your own home, and you can get as fit as you want. So can I bring that into my spiritual life? Can I church on my own? Let me share why I think that's not a viable option for us. For one, belonging to the church helps us become what we were intended to be. Belonging to the church helps us become what we were intended to be. Listen, if you're a follower of Jesus, you're already a member of the church already, right? Like whether you've ever formally signed up or become a member of a church, or even if you're a part of some group of people that calls itself a church, if you're following Jesus, you're a member of the church, like in its most literal and simplest sense. Being part of the church, it doesn't mean you have to be part of this church, right? This isn't Curtis Lake Church is not the church. This is my church. This is my family. And so I think this is the best church in the world. But it's not. It's not. Like there's other churches you can go to that are going to be way better than we are. I'm not trying to be like falsely humble. I'm dead serious. Like you can find churches that they're gonna do church way better than we do, right? But this is my church. This is my family. I love my family. I am allied to my family. There's way better families than my family. Ask them. Some of them are here, right? Right. You probably feel the same way, but still, I mean, there's no other family that I want. I want my family. Belonging to the church helps us become what we were intended to be. Belonging to the church is a spiritual discipline, right? Belonging to the church. It's a spiritual discipline. It's not the most important thing that you need to do as a Christian, but it's also not any less important than any of the other spiritual disciplines that you could think of. When we belong to a church, it helps us to grow in self-awareness. You see, if I close myself off to other people, which again, if I commit myself to a private kind of discipleship, where I'm just gonna stay in my lane and do my thing with Jesus, kind of on my own. I'm just not gonna mess with the mess of this thing called the church. But if I do that, if I close myself off to other people, then I become less others-centered. I become more self-centered. And then, ironically, I become less self-aware. How many of you ever witnessed a person who was very, very self-centered, but clearly very not self-aware, right? Like those things go hand in hand. Who am I? Who am I becoming? How am I being formed? We talk about this all the time. We are all being formed. All the time. We are being formed into something. What we're doing right now, this is forming us. Where we go from here and what we decide to do later on in the day and how we spend like the other parts of our time, like those things they all contribute to how we are being formed, what we are being formed into. So who am I? Who am I becoming? Well, belonging to the church helps me to become what I am intended to be. And then secondly, being the church brings God's goodness to a world that's dying for it. I know that John Lennon very expressly put to song a mantra that much of the world has adopted. Right? In that song, Imagine, where The dream is to live in a world where there's no heaven and no hell. To live in a world where there's no thing like religion that is separating one person from another. Right? The chorus of the song says, "You may say I'm only a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you will join us, and then the world will be as one." That is the vision for some, right? That religion, again, the net effect of such things as Christianity, the church, that they're bad for the world. And the reason why that kind of observation can be made is because there have been and there will be experiences where the church does harm. The church has the opportunity to be one of two ways. It can either be toxic or it can be tov. Tov is the Hebrew word for good. A very important theme throughout the Bible is the theme of what is good, how God is good, what is God's goodness that he wants to bring into the world. Well, being the church in the way that we are called to be the church provides us the opportunity to bring God's goodness to a world that's dying for it. We learn by being together. What is it that God wants to teach us about things like character and virtue? You see, while we work really hard at various things that we do, like, let's be honest, the musicians and the singers, they didn't just come up here and frantically scramble together a handful of songs and then come up. I mean, they practiced, they worked on, they did what they could to ultimately to play and to sing in a way that would be beyond pleasant as they lead us in worship, right? And as important as it is to, as we think about the various programs and just the various functions of what it means to be the church, yes, I mean, there needs to be a commitment to doing things really well, but the far greater thing that we need to understand as a church is, well, who are we becoming? Who are you becoming? Who am I becoming? What is the person that this guy, what is the person that you are becoming? Through being together, we learn to answer the question, what is good? What is good? What does it mean to be growing in real goodness? We'll do things like study how to live out the 10 Commandments. Things that maybe you wouldn't have the opportunity to otherwise engage if you weren't living within the context of a church. We, as a church, we long to pursue the ethic of the prophets who called out the unrighteousness of their day, to fulfill what Micah says is God's will for us, to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. As a church, we are pursuing the ethic of how to live out Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, 3 chapters that'll just absolutely blow you away with how our lives are to subvert the culture of our world. How do we pursue life being lived in the Spirit as opposed to just simply giving in to the works of the flesh, as Paul puts it in his letter to the Galatians? How do we pursue living out the 2 great commandments of loving God with all our hearts and loving our neighbor as ourselves? Being the church gives us the opportunity to bring God's goodness to a world that's dying for it. And so I believe in the church. And I believe there's a place for each of us, if we want to embrace, maybe to re-embrace, so that we can see play out in our own lives what God is ultimately wanting to form us into, not only as an individual disciple of Jesus, but as one who is part of a greater number of disciples of Jesus. And this morning, I just very simply want to leverage the opportunity of having this assembled group of people to invite you to be a part of that, if you so wish. If you're here this morning and this is all kind of brand new to you and you just are sitting here wondering, what do I do with this? I want to encourage you that maybe the next thing for you to do is to come back. Come back. Come back next week. Just see. See what happens. Maybe you've been gathering together with this church for a period of time, and you'd say, well, yeah, this is kind of my church, but you're more on the sidelines, just haven't really embraced, haven't really kind of jumped in. I want to encourage you to come back for more. There are a lot of different ways that you can find yourself become more deeply rooted in and connected to our church. Or find another church to do that with. I don't care if you come to this church. I mean, you're welcome to. I don't care. I mean, reality is if you do, you're just going to be a bigger, more of a headache for me anyway. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Like, how small can we grow Curtis Lake Church? Yeah. No, maybe like if this is the place for you, then that's great. But this isn't the place for everybody, right? But the most important thing you need to know is just how deeply God wants to be in deep and meaningful relationship with you. And so you got to seek that out. You got to find that. Not alone, not in isolation, but with somebody else. And then finally, I'll tell you, I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with this, but as I was thinking about today, as I was preparing for today, if you're here this morning and you're a part of this church or have been a part of this church, or maybe this is just kind of the first time back to church for you for in a really long time, but you would describe yourself as one whose faith is suffering. You'd say, my faith is just like it's on the ledge here, and I don't know what to do with that. I just want you to know, like, my heart is burdened and heavy for you this morning, if that's you. So what I'm going to invite you to do, if that's you this morning, I'm just going to invite you, this might sound a little cold and informal. You're welcome to come and share that with me if you want, but you don't have to. If you want, just shoot me an email today or later on this week. Say, Josh, listen, I'm that person. My faith is on the brink. I'm not giving up on Jesus, but this whole church business, I really don't know if it's for me anymore. I just don't really know if this is the best thing for me. Like I've only experienced more negative things. Like being part of a church feels like it's been more harmful to this point. If that's you, and you want to have a conversation about it and maybe kind of dig into that, like, again, my heart is just very, very burdened for you this morning. And so I'm going to invite you to shoot me an email, and then we'll figure out a way to do something with that. All right?